Willow Creek looked like the perfect town on the map: quiet streets, tidy lawns, and neighbors waving with polite smiles. But Jordan Harris knew the truth. The town only smiled on the surface. Beneath the calm streets, subtle prejudice lingered everywhere: teachers' cautious glances, whispered warnings from parents, and students sizing him up before he even spoke. Sundays brought polite conversations about unity. Yet Mondays reminded him that some people were always more welcome than others. Jordan felt it in grocery stores, classrooms, and even in friendly smiles that faded the moment he approached. Willow Creek was peaceful only for those who fit the town's quiet rules. For Jordan, every glance and whisper was a reminder. His skin made him stand out in ways he never asked for. Willow Creek Middle School loved to display posters about fairness, respect, and kindness. Teachers spoke of equality during assemblies, and parents nodded proudly. But inside, fairness was just decoration. Jordan noticed teachers watching him more closely than others, praising the same behavior in other students but questioning him. Small slights like being ignored when raising his hand or assumed guilty without proof added up like invisible bruises. The school whispered injustice quietly. Assumptions replaced facts. And some students were given second chances while Jordan was always under suspicion. To outsiders, Willow Creek Middle was a model of fairness. To Jordan, it was a place where appearances mattered more than truth. Jordan Harris was quiet but thoughtful. He carried his world in a worn sketchbook, filled with drawings of characters and worlds where people weren't judged for who they were. While others dreamed of sports or popularity, Jordan dreamed of creating art that could reach far beyond Willow Creek. At home, his mother Angela often found him by the window, pencil in hand, lost in imagination. Each drawing was a small rebellion against a world that often misunderstood him. Though prejudice chipped at his confidence, Jordan held on tightly to his dreams, believing that one day his talent could take him somewhere safer, somewhere he could truly belong. Inside him burned hope. One day, the world would see him not the prejudice attached to his skin. Angela Harris was more than a mother. She was Jordan's shield. Life had tested her with long workdays, financial struggles, and society's judgment of a single mother. Yet she never gave up. Every morning she prepared breakfast, walked Jordan to school, and reminded him of his worth. You're strong, baby. You're smart. No matter how this world treats you, never forget you matter. Her love protected Jordan from subtle racism, whispered assumptions, and small injustices. It was this love that allowed him to return to his sketchbook after each difficult day, to continue dreaming, and to hold on to hope. Angela's faith in him reminded Jordan that even in a world full of doubt, there were people who truly saw him. From a young age, Jordan noticed small biases everywhere. Teachers ignored him when he answered correctly. Students whispered comments he didn't understand, and adults judged him silently. At first, it hurt. But with his mother's encouragement, never react to small minds. Rise above. Jordan learned to let them slide. He turned every microaggression into silent motivation. Each assumption, each unfair glance, became a reminder to focus on his dreams. Jordan realized that the world would not always be fair, but he could control his response. These small biases strengthened his resilience, preparing him for the bigger challenges that were yet to come. It was supposed to be a normal morning. Jordan packed his backpack, waved to his mother, and walked to school thinking about his math quiz. The streets were calm, the air crisp, and everything seemed routine. But that morning was anything but ordinary. A simple, everyday act, stopping to help a classmate who fell, would spark a chain of events that changed everything. By the time he reached the classroom, whispers had already begun. What should have been an innocent day turned into fear, confusion, and unfair judgment. Jordan didn't know it yet, but his world was about to shift in ways he could never imagine. During lunch, a teacher realized her expensive smartphone was missing. Normally, she might ask questions, check the classroom calmly, or think it was misplaced. But panic took over, and without evidence, one student immediately became the focus. Jordan. He had been nearby for only a minute, helping a classmate, but assumptions replaced facts. Staff and students quickly adopted the narrative. Jordan must have taken it. Fear overshadowed reason. Jordan was called to the office, confused and terrified, as the first wave of accusations landed. What should have been handled calmly had turned into a storm of suspicion, fueled not by proof but by bias. As Jordan walked to the office, every pair of eyes followed him. Students whispered, stared, and assumed the worst. Teachers monitored silently, already convinced of his guilt. No one asked questions, no one checked evidence. Jordan felt the weight of assumptions pressing down on him. A simple glance or innocent gesture was interpreted as suspicious. In that moment, he realized that in Willow Creek, people often judged by skin color and stereotypes rather than truth. His heart sank as he saw how quickly perception could replace reality. Miss Carter's panic escalated the situation. Her heart raced, hands trembling, voice shaky. Instead of calmly investigating, her fear created a shortcut in her mind. Jordan must be guilty. She pulled him aside, ignoring his innocence, and treated him as if he had done something wrong. Students observed silently, taking cues from her panic. Jordan's confusion deepened. He hadn't done anything, but the panic of one authority figure turned an innocent boy into a suspect, showing how fear can quickly override fairness and truth. Miss Carter called the police, and just like that, Jordan's day on life shifted. One phone call, based on panic and assumption, escalated the situation beyond repair. The message was simple. A student stole a phone, send officers immediately. But for Jordan, it meant being treated like a criminal without evidence. What could have been handled quietly became a public spectacle. Jordan remained seated, unaware that a single decision would label him unfairly, shaking his sense of safety, justice, and trust in adults. The loud sirens of police cars shattered the quiet schoolyard. Students froze mid-laugh, teachers stiffened, and Jordan's heart sank. What was a normal recess turned into a scene of fear. Whispers filled the air. Who's it for? Maybe Jordan. Jordan felt the world closing in. Every siren became a countdown, a warning that his innocence might no longer protect him. The calm of Willow Creek Middle had been replaced with tension, suspicion, and the terrifying presence of authority. Jordan stood frozen as officers handcuffed him, the cold metal biting his wrists. Students watched silently, some shocked, some guilty, some curious. No one asked if he was okay. Jordan's voice trembled as he tried to protest. I didn't do anything, but no one listened. His confusion and fear were visible for all to see. Teachers remained passive observers. Jordan's innocence contrasted sharply with the assumptions around him. That day, the schoolyard taught a painful lesson. Assumptions could outweigh truth, and innocence could be punished without evidence. What started as whispers among students had escalated into silent accusations. I think it was Jordan. And he always seemed suspicious. Filled the hallways. Small gossip transformed into collective judgment. Jordan noticed the way peers' eyes followed him, how gestures were interpreted as guilt, and how teachers silently reinforced assumptions. Each whisper became a dagger to his reputation, slicing away trust and confidence. The innocent boy who had simply been nearby was now a symbol of fear, judged without evidence. As officers led Jordan out, his heart shattered. Confusion, fear, and pain overwhelmed him. He had done nothing wrong, yet authority treated him as guilty. Students watched silently, some hiding guilt, some frozen. Jordan's voice trembled as he tried to explain, but no one would listen. As officers led Jordan out, his heart shattered. Confusion, fear, and pain overwhelmed him. He had done nothing wrong, yet authority treated him as guilty. Students watched silently, some hiding guilt, some frozen. Jordan's voice trembled as he tried to explain, but no one would listen. In that moment, he became more than a boy. He became a symbol of systemic unfairness. Heartbreak mixed with a growing determination. He would survive this, and his voice would be heard. Angela Harris ran through the hallways, arriving just as officers escorted Jordan out. Her heart ached, seeing her son handcuffed, confusion and fear written all over his face. Students whispered, some avoided eye contact, others stared. Angela's tears fell silently as she ran alongside him. Powerless to stop the public humiliation, Jordan, innocent and terrified, was being treated as a criminal. That morning, Angela realized a harsh truth. Sometimes, by the time you arrive, the world has already judged. Jordan Harris sat alone in the small, fluorescent-lit interrogation room. The walls were bare, white, and suffocating, making the space feel smaller than it already was. Every tick of the clock echoed loudly, each second stretching longer than the last. The chair under him was hard, uncomfortable, and unyielding, just like the situation he found himself in. He tried to calm his racing thoughts, but the silence pressed down on him, heavy and unrelenting. He replayed the morning over and over in his head, helping a classmate, walking to the office, the panic, the whispers, the handcuffs. None of it made sense, yet it was all real. Every sound outside the room, footsteps, a door opening, a distant voice made him jump, fearing the next accusation. Jordan's mind was a storm of fear, confusion, and frustration. He wanted to explain, to shout, to cry, but no one had asked him anything yet. He felt invisible and simultaneously judged, as if the room itself were a silent jury. The cold walls weren't just walls, they were barriers, pressing in on his innocence, making him feel trapped in a system that had already decided his guilt. In that quiet, oppressive space, Jordan realized that being alone amplified every emotion, every fear, and every unfair assumption the world had already made about him. Jordan Harris gripped the edges of the hard chair, trying to steady himself, but his hands shook uncontrollably. He wanted to appear calm, to show strength, but the adrenaline in his body betrayed him. Every moment in the cold, bright interrogation room felt like a battle he hadn't asked for. He wasn't a criminal. He was just a boy who had tried to help a classmate, yet now his innocence seemed invisible to everyone around him. He took a deep breath, hoping it would quiet his trembling, but the fear lingered. The sound of approaching footsteps made his heart race faster. He knew he had to stay composed, had to fight internally to prove to himself that he wasn't powerless, even if the adults and officers around him were convinced otherwise. Jordan's mind wandered to his mother Angela, and the comfort of her voice telling him he was strong and capable. That thought gave him a spark of courage. He straightened his back, lifted his chin, and forced his hands to unclench, even if they still trembled. In that room, bravery wasn't about being fearless. It was about standing tall when everything inside you screamed that the world had already judged you unfairly. Jordan learned that day that courage could exist even in the quietest, shakiest moments. As Jordan sat in the cold interrogation room, memories of being watched and judged followed him like dark shadows. From the first day of school, he had learned that eyes often lingered on him longer than on anyone else. Classrooms, hallways, cafeterias, he could feel the weight of invisible gazes, whispers that never reached his ears but settled heavily in his chest. Today, those memories collided with reality, amplifying his fear and frustration. He remembered teachers scanning him suspiciously over minor mistakes, classmates giving him side-eye for doing nothing wrong, and neighbors silently judging him while pretending to be polite. Each memory was a reminder that his innocence often went unseen. Now, in the fluorescent-lit room, it felt as if the shadows of all those past judgments had gathered, pressing down on him, making the walls feel even tighter. Jordan tried to focus on the present, telling himself he was strong, that he had done nothing wrong, yet the shadows whispered doubt into his mind. He felt the familiar mixture of anger and helplessness, the unfairness of a world ready to assume the worst about him. Even in moments of solitude, Jordan realized he was never truly alone. The shadows of prejudice followed, a constant reminder that society's gaze often judges before it understands. Jordan Harris closed his eyes for a moment, trying to block out the fluorescent lights and the quiet hum of the interrogation room. But his mind kept replaying memories of every time he had been labeled suspicious for simply existing. In the grocery store, a clerk had followed him down the aisle, eyes flicking nervously, as if his presence alone was a threat. At school, teachers would give him extra scrutiny, asking questions he didn't understand, assuming the worst before hearing the truth. Even playground games and group projects were marred by subtle judgments, his quiet nature misread as defiance, his focus mistaken for hiding something. These memories hit harder today. The missing phone incident had escalated quickly, but it was part of a pattern that Jordan had felt all his life. Each accusation, each whispered doubt, was a reminder that the world often judged him by the color of his skin rather than the content of his character. Jordan gritted his teeth, trying to breathe through the frustration and fear. Being labeled suspicious had become a familiar burden, one he had carried silently, teaching him to be cautious, careful, and resilient. But now, as the officers stood outside the door, the weight of those past judgments felt heavier than ever. Jordan Harris sat stiffly in the cold interrogation room, feeling the familiar ache of having to prove he wasn't a threat. Every day, in small ways and large, he had to show the world he was harmless, capable, and trustworthy simply because of the assumptions attached to his skin. At school, he raised his hand carefully, answered questions politely, and never caused trouble. Yet he still felt the weight of suspicion hovering over him like an invisible shadow. Even simple acts, walking down the hallway, holding a pencil, or offering to help a friend, had been misread in the past. Each misunderstanding left a mark, slowly eroding his sense of safety. Today, the stakes were higher. A missing phone had turned into a public accusation, and Jordan felt the suffocating pressure of eyes, whispers, and assumptions pressing in. He wanted to explain, to show he had done nothing wrong, but the burden of proof always seemed to fall on him, while no one questioned the assumptions of others. The pain wasn't just in being accused, it was in realizing that, no matter how careful or honest he was, he had to constantly fight for recognition of his innocence. Jordan understood, painfully, that in this world, surviving often meant proving repeatedly that you weren't a threat even when all you wanted was to be seen as human. By the time Jordan returned home that evening, the world outside had already shifted. His phone buzzed relentlessly with messages, notifications, and social media alerts. Headlines from local news outlets screamed across screens. Student accused of theft at Willow Creek Middle, and police investigate classroom incident. Jordan felt as if the words themselves were punching him, twisting reality. Overnight, he had been transformed from a quiet, respectful boy into a villain in the eyes of the world. He scrolled through comments, each one sharper than the last. Strangers speculated about his guilt, teachers shared cautious opinions, and classmates whispered behind screens. No one seemed to care about the facts, the truth, or his side of the story. It wasn't just the schoolyard anymore. The entire town, and now the wider community, had assumed the worst. Jordan sank into the couch, his heart heavy. The headlines weren't just words, they were judgments, assumptions, and biases cemented into public perception. In a single night, the boy who had always tried to stay invisible had been made hyper-visible, and every eye that read those headlines would see him as dangerous, guilty, and different. That day, Jordan realized that in a world fueled by fear and assumptions, innocence alone was powerless. Reputation could be destroyed faster than it could ever be defended. The next morning, Jordan walked into school to find the atmosphere heavier than ever. Parents, fueled by the sensational headlines, whispered warnings to one another, their voices laced with fear. "Did you hear about Jordan Harris?" they asked, eyes wide, as if mere proximity could be dangerous. None of them had asked a single question, none had sought facts, yet judgment had already taken root. Inside the school, students mirrored that fear. Some avoided Jordan entirely, crossing the hall to steer clear. Others stared, pointing silently, their curiosity mixed with suspicion. Teachers tried to maintain professionalism, but even they couldn't escape the influence of anxious parents and the weight of public opinion. Jordan felt it all, every whisper, every judgment, every cautious glance. He was innocent, but the world had decided otherwise, and that decision spread faster than he could explain. The unfairness of it burned inside him, a mixture of anger, sadness, and disbelief. In that moment, Jordan understood a painful truth. Fear is contagious, and assumptions are easier to spread than truth. Parents, society, and peers had all become participants in a narrative that painted him guilty without ever knowing the facts. That day, Jordan learned that innocence alone couldn't shield him from the judgments of others. Angela Harris stormed into the police station, heart racing, breath uneven. She had followed the trail of rumors, whispers, and frantic calls, refusing to let her son face this injustice alone. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead as she pushed past officers, her voice sharp and unwavering. "Where is my son? What's happening?" Her presence immediately shifted the energy in the room. Officers glanced up, surprised by her determination and intensity. Jordan sat in the corner, handcuffed, eyes wide, and relief washed over him at the sight of his mother. In that instant, she became more than a parent. She was a shield, a voice, and a force that refused to let fear and assumptions dictate her child's fate. Angela demanded answers, refusing to accept vague statements or half-truths. She recounted Jordan's character, his history of honesty, and his quiet strength. Every word carried weight, challenging the officers to see beyond the narrative spun by panic and assumption. Jordan felt the warmth of her presence, the unshakable faith of a parent who refused to let the world define her child unfairly. That moment was a turning point, not just in the incident, but in Jordan's understanding that love, courage, and advocacy could stand against fear, bias, and injustice. When news of Jordan's arrest reached the Harris household, Angela wasted no time contacting Grace Miller, a local attorney known for her calm authority and relentless dedication to justice. Grace arrived at the police station with a quiet confidence, her presence immediately commanding attention. She didn't yell or demand. Instead, she spoke with precision, clarity, and a firm sense of purpose that left no room for doubt. "Let's review the facts," she said, her voice steady but firm, demanding the officers consider evidence over assumption. Grace carefully questioned each claim, pointing out inconsistencies and highlighting the lack of proof against Jordan. Her quiet power was different from Angela's emotional intensity. It was composed, methodical, and authoritative, a reminder that courage doesn't always roar. Sometimes it reasons, persuades, and protects. Jordan watched in awe as Grace worked, feeling a flicker of hope for the first time since the chaos began. The tension in the room shifted slightly as officers realized they were no longer in control. Grace's presence reminded everyone that justice could still prevail, even when panic and prejudice had taken over. In that moment, Jordan understood a new form of strength, the kind that doesn't shout, but commands respect and clears a path for truth. Grace Miller became more than an attorney. She became a beacon of hope in the storm surrounding him. As Grace Miller listened to the chaotic retelling of events, her eyes settled on Jordan. He sat quietly, head slightly bowed, hands trembling but folded neatly in his lap. Too many, his silence could have been mistaken for guilt or defiance. But Grace, experienced and observant, recognized the pain hiding behind those quiet eyes. She saw the confusion, the fear, and the heartbreak of a boy forced into a world that had judged him without reason. Jordan wanted to speak, to explain, to plead his innocence, but the weight of the situation paralyzed him. Words failed him. The room was loud with assumptions, whispers, and tension, yet he remained still, trying to appear brave while every nerve screamed for comfort. Grace approached him calmly, placing a reassuring hand on his shoulder, and spoke softly. "I see you, Jordan. I know the truth. You're not alone in this." Her understanding cut through the suffocating walls of judgment and suspicion. For the first time that day, Jordan felt seen not as a suspect, not as a headline, but as a boy enduring something he didn't deserve. Grace understood that true advocacy required more than facts. It required empathy, recognizing the human hurt that often went unnoticed behind silence. Grace Miller's gaze sharpened as she listened to the fragmented stories from the school staff. Her mind pieced together inconsistencies, half-truths, and careful omissions that pointed to something deeper than a simple misunderstanding. She turned to Jordan and Angela, her voice steady and unwavering. I promise you we will uncover everything the school has tried to hide. It wasn't just a legal promise. It was a vow to challenge a system that had quietly allowed bias and panic to dictate judgment. Grace knew that schools often protected their reputations over their students, sweeping uncomfortable truths under the rug. But she wasn't going to let that happen to Jordan. Every detail, every assumption, and every whispered accusation would be scrutinized until the truth emerged. Jordan felt a flicker of hope spark inside him. For the first time since the morning chaos, he sensed that someone believed in him not just in theory, but in action. Grace's promise wasn't about words. It was about power, persistence, and the courage to hold institutions accountable. That day, Jordan understood the meaning of true advocacy. It required someone willing to confront discomfort, expose hidden truths, and fight for justice when the world had already judged unfairly. With Grace by his side, he felt ready to face the storm ahead. As Grace Miller dug deeper, a series of emails from teachers surfaced, painting a troubling picture. They revealed subtle biases, assumptions, and instances where Jordan had been treated differently from his classmates. Comments that seemed harmless at first glance. Keep an eye on Jordan, or he seems nervous. Probably hiding something suddenly took on a harsher weight when paired with the missing phone incident. These messages showed that suspicion had been cultivated over time, quietly and systematically. Teachers had overlooked other possibilities, allowed assumptions to guide their judgments, and failed to support a student who had consistently demonstrated honesty and integrity. Jordan read some of the emails with Angela beside him, feeling a mix of anger, hurt, and validation. For years, he had sensed its small glances, microaggressions, whispered doubts, but now it was documented. Grace explained calmly, "This isn't about a single mistake. This is a pattern, and patterns are powerful evidence. They show intent, bias, and negligence." Jordan felt a mix of relief and heartbreak. Relief that the truth could be exposed, and heartbreak for the countless times he had silently carried the weight of unfair treatment. The emails were proof that his struggle wasn't imagined. It had been real, quiet, and insidious. And finally, the world might have to see it too. As Grace Miller continued her investigation, a troubling pattern emerged. Jordan's case wasn't an isolated incident. Records, emails, and accounts from other students revealed that Black students in Willow Creek Middle had repeatedly been blamed for minor mistakes or accidents, often without evidence or investigation. Teachers and staff seemed to react faster, assume guilt more readily, and escalate situations in ways that mirrored Jordan's experience. The realization hit hard. Jordan had been told to ignore small biases, to stay silent, and to rise above assumptions, but now, the larger truth became undeniable. His experiences were part of a systemic pattern, not a one-off misunderstanding. Fear, prejudice, and quick assumptions had created an environment where innocence didn't matter, and suspicion was handed out unevenly. Angela felt both anger and heartbreak as she read through the reports. Jordan, too, struggled with a mixture of validation and pain. Finally, the evidence existed, but it revealed a reality he had been living in for years. Grace looked at them both and said firmly, "This isn't just about one incident. It's about a system that repeatedly targets students like Jordan. We're going to make sure it's seen, and that accountability follows." In that moment, Jordan realized he wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. He was standing against a pattern that affected many others, and that thought strengthened his resolve. As the investigation unfolded, Jordan Harris discovered a painful truth. His name had already been whispered through the halls long before the phone went missing. Teachers and students alike had quietly circulated assumptions about him, small suspicions that never seemed serious until the incident escalated. It was as if the missing phone had merely given those whispers permission to grow louder, to solidify into accusations that no one paused to question. Jordan felt a mixture of shock and heartbreak. He remembered moments in school when glances lingered too long or hushed comments followed him down the hallway. Now, those subtle moments had a name, a target, him. The realization made him see the incident in a new light, not just as a misunderstanding, But as the culmination of years of quiet prejudice, Angela squeezed his hand, seeing the hurt in his eyes. Grace Miller explained that this pattern of whispers and assumptions was critical evidence. It showed that the escalation wasn't accidental. Jordan hadn't been singled out randomly. He had been quietly prejudged for years, and the system had allowed it to happen. For the first time, Jordan understood how deeply bias had shaped the events around him. But he also recognized that uncovering this truth was the first step toward reclaiming his dignity and fighting for justice. As the investigation continued, Grace Miller uncovered another painful layer. Students who admitted to targeting Jordan for months. They confessed to spreading whispers, sharing rumors, and casting suspicious glances, all without evidence, all guided by fear and bias. The small, seemingly harmless actions, the rolling of eyes, whispered warnings, and exclusion from group activities were not random but deliberate, part of a campaign of subtle harassment. Jordan sat quietly as these admissions came to light, a mix of relief and hurt swirling inside him. Relief that finally, the truth was being recognized and recorded. Hurt because he had endured months of unnecessary scrutiny, isolation, and judgment from peers who should have been allies in childhood. For years, he had wondered if he imagined the hostility. Now, it was undeniable. Angela held his hand tightly, proud that Jordan's strength had carried him through months of quiet pain. Grace explained that these testimonies were vital, showing a pattern of targeted behavior that escalated the morning of the missing phone incident. Jordan realized that while the whispers and rumors had caused deep emotional wounds, they had also laid the groundwork for justice. With the truth revealed, the system could no longer ignore the bias, and he could finally begin reclaiming his voice and dignity. After weeks of whispers, accusations, and relentless scrutiny, Jordan Harris began to feel the heavy weight of self-doubt. Every glance, every rumor, every incident had chipped away at his confidence, leaving him questioning himself. Maybe he wondered quietly, he was the problem. Had he done something wrong without realizing it? Was there something about him that drew suspicion, that made people uneasy? The thought was painful, a quiet ache in the chest that grew heavier with each passing day. He replayed interactions in his mind, analyzing every word, every gesture, hoping to find an explanation. But the harder he looked, the more he realized there was nothing truly wrong, only assumptions, fear, and prejudice projected onto him. Yet even knowing this didn't fully erase the creeping feeling of inadequacy. Angela noticed the change in him, the slight slump of his shoulders, the way he hesitated to speak. She reminded him gently, "Jordan, you are not the problem. The problem is the assumptions others make about you without knowing you." Jordan clung to her words, realizing that the fight wasn't about fixing himself, it was about challenging a world that had misjudged him. Slowly, he began to understand that resilience wasn't denying self-doubt, but confronting it while refusing to let it define him. Jordan Harris sat on the edge of his bed, staring blankly at the worn notebook that had once been his sanctuary. Inside were sketches, stories, and ideas, his dreams in ink and paper. Each page had been a place to imagine a world where he could be seen for who he truly was, not judged before being understood. But now, after months of whispers, accusations, and systemic bias, the notebook felt heavy, suffocating, and pointless. In a moment of frustration and despair, Jordan hurled it across the room. Pages scattered like fallen leaves, each one a reminder of dreams that seemed unreachable in a world that judged him first and listened later. The act wasn't just anger, it was a breaking point, a raw, human response to the cumulative weight of unfairness. Angela entered the room and saw the mess, her heart aching. She didn't scold him. She understood that even the strongest had moments of collapse. Grace Miller's words echoed in his mind. This fight wasn't about giving up, it was about finding strength even when the world seemed determined to crush it. Jordan realized, painfully, that breaking didn't make him weak. It meant he was human, carrying the burden of a system that had misjudged him, but also that he could rise, rebuild, and continue to fight for the justice he deserved. After the emotional storm, Jordan sank into his mother's embrace, letting the weight of the world press against her warmth. Angela Harris held him tightly, rocking him gently, as if her arms could shield him from the prejudice and pain he had endured. The months of whispers, assumptions, and unfounded accusations had left invisible scars, and for a moment, Jordan allowed himself to release the fear and frustration he had carried silently. "Jordan," she whispered softly, her voice firm yet tender, "your skin is not a crime. None of this is your fault." Her words were a lifeline, cutting through the layers of self-doubt that had begun to settle in his heart. She reminded him that the judgments of others reflected their fear and bias, not his worth or character. Jordan clung to her, drawing strength from her unwavering belief in him. In that embrace, he felt seen and understood, not as a suspect or a headline, but as a son, a young man with dreams and integrity. The pain hadn't vanished, but the love surrounding him became a source of courage. In that quiet moment, Jordan realized that resilience often begins with being reminded of your humanity, and that even amidst injustice, a mother's love could restore hope, dignity, and the belief that he was more than the world's assumptions. The local town hall buzzed with tension as parents, teachers, and community members packed into the room. What was meant to be a discussion about the school incident quickly escalated into loud arguments about race, fairness, and accountability. Voices clashed, some fueled by fear, others by frustration, and Jordan's name became a symbol in debates he couldn't even follow. Parents argued over whether the school had acted too harshly or not harshly enough, while subtle and not-so-subtle racial undertones threaded through the conversation. "It's about safety," one parent shouted. "It's about assumptions," another countered. Jordan felt small in the midst of the shouting, the loud words echoing the whispers and biases he had faced for months. Angela and Grace watched closely, understanding that the meeting reflected the broader problem: prejudice and fear-shaping judgments before facts could be seen. The arguments were chaotic, often illogical, but they revealed the depth of the town's divisions and the silent assumptions that had influenced the way Jordan had been treated. For Jordan, it was both frightening and illuminating. The room's cacophony reminded him that his struggle was not just personal, it was a reflection of society's larger challenges with race, bias, and the urgent need for understanding, empathy, and justice. At the next community gathering, the divisions were clear. Some stood firmly with Jordan, their voices advocating for truth, fairness, and justice. Teachers who had witnessed his character, parents who knew his integrity, and students who had seen his quiet kindness spoke out, challenging assumptions and defending his innocence. Their words were measured but powerful, a counterweight to the fear and prejudice that had dominated the conversation for weeks. Yet, across the room, others stood with fear. Their voices were loud, quick to judge, quick to blame, echoing the assumptions that had fueled the morning of the incident. Whispers of distrust, worry, and bias flowed freely, shaping opinions before evidence could even be considered. Jordan felt the weight of both sides pressing in, the reassurance from those who believed in him, and the sting from those who still questioned him simply because of the color of his skin. Angela held his hand tightly, a quiet anchor amidst the tension. Grace reminded him that truth often requires patience, persistence, and courage. In that moment, Jordan realized that the world wouldn't be divided by facts alone, but by the willingness of some to stand with justice, while others allowed fear to guide their judgment. Grace Miller stood before Jordan and Angela, her expression calm but resolute. "Jordan," she said, "we're not just fighting this single incident. We're fighting a system that has allowed assumptions, fear, and bias to dictate how students like you are treated." Her words landed with weight, cutting through the fear and uncertainty that had consumed them for weeks. She explained how institutional practices, ingrained prejudices, and unexamined policies had created an environment where Black students were disproportionately scrutinized, blamed, and marginalized. The school's reactions weren't isolated mistakes, they were part of a pattern, a system that allowed bias to thrive quietly behind rules and procedures. Jordan felt a mix of fear and determination. The challenge was larger than he had imagined, but understanding the scope of the problem gave him purpose. Angela squeezed his hand, her presence grounding him in the middle of a storm of uncertainty. Grace's warning wasn't meant to discourage, it was a call to action. She reminded them that real change required patience, evidence, and courage to confront institutions that often protected their reputation over fairness. Jordan realized that this fight wasn't just for him, it was for every student who might face the same assumptions, biases, and injustices in the future. It was the moment he understood that justice often demands more than innocence, it demands persistence. Jordan Harris sat quietly in the meeting room, the weight of the past weeks pressing heavily on him. Every whisper, every accusation, every assumption had led to this moment. Around him, voices debated, opinions clashed, and tensions ran high. Yet, amid the chaos, he realized the power he held, the choice to stay silent or finally speak his truth. For months, silence had been his shield. It had protected him from immediate judgment but also allowed misconceptions to grow unchecked. Speaking up felt risky, vulnerability made him a target, and he feared the backlash from those unwilling to listen. But the longer he remained quiet, the more the story of his innocence could be overshadowed by prejudice, rumors, and fear. He glanced at Angela and Grace, both offering subtle nods of encouragement. Their faith reminded him that his words mattered, that telling his truth could confront assumptions, educate others, and challenge the system that had misjudged him. Taking a deep breath, Jordan felt a spark of courage ignite within him. He understood that real strength wasn't the absence of fear, it was the willingness to speak, even when the world seemed ready to doubt. In that moment, Jordan chose to reclaim his voice and assert his humanity. The courtroom buzzed with anticipation, a tense silence lingering beneath the murmurs of spectators. Jordan Harris walked in with his mother, Angela, and attorney Grace Miller by his side, feeling the heavy weight of every gaze upon him. The eyes in the room didn't just see a student, they saw a headline, a rumor, a story shaped by fear and assumptions. Every glance felt like a judgment before a single word had been spoken. Reporters scribbled notes, neighbors whispered quietly, and some parents leaned forward expectantly, convinced of their own interpretations of the events. Jordan's heart raced as he realized that the courtroom was more than a legal arena. It was a stage where public opinion and bias had already cast him as guilty. The walls seemed to close in, the bright lights highlighting every movement, every nervous twitch. He caught sight of familiar faces, some supportive, some skeptical, and felt the invisible line dividing belief and doubt. Every eye seemed ready to interpret his silence as shame or guilt, and every whisper amplified the tension in the air. Jordan took a deep breath, grounding himself in the presence of Grace and Angela. He understood that in this room, innocence alone wouldn't speak. He would have to confront not just the law, but the assumptions of everyone watching him. Jordan Harris sat quietly in the courtroom, feeling smaller than he had ever felt in his life. The room seemed designed to intimidate, with high ceilings, stiff wooden benches, and cold echoing walls that amplified every whisper and shuffled paper. The air smelled faintly of polished wood and tension, and every corner seemed to hold a judge's gaze, waiting to measure him, to determine his worth before hearing a single word. He folded his hands tightly in his lap, keeping his head down, trying to shrink into himself. The weight of months of whispered suspicions, false accusations, and systemic bias pressed on his shoulders, making him feel as though the room itself was trying to crush his spirit. Each passing minute made him more aware of the stark contrast between his smallness and the towering expectations and judgments around him. Angela sat close, offering quiet reassurance, and Grace Miller's calm presence at his side gave him a flicker of courage. Despite the intimidating environment, Jordan realized that the room could not contain his truth, it could not erase the years of character, resilience, and honesty he had built. In that moment, Jordan understood that the room's design could challenge him, but it could not define him. His spirit, though tested, remained unbroken. The prosecutor rose, his tone firm and deliberate, and began presenting Jordan Harris as a threat. Every word seemed carefully chosen to make Jordan appear guilty, dangerous, and untrustworthy. He cited assumptions, misinterpreted actions, and the missing phone incident as though they were proof, ignoring the lack of actual evidence. The courtroom seemed to tighten around Jordan, each statement a weight, pressing him further into his seat. Jordan felt his chest tighten as the narrative unfolded. He wanted to speak, to correct the distortions, but the formal setting and the intensity of the moment made it difficult. The prosecutor didn't just tell the story, he framed it with subtle urgency, suggesting Jordan's very presence was suspicious. Eyes in the courtroom followed every gesture, and Jordan felt the room swallowing him, measuring him against fears and biases rather than facts. Angela gripped his hand, whispering reassurance, while Grace Miller's calm, focused gaze reminded him that truth had power, even against the loudest accusations. She had prepared for this, anticipating the strategy to paint him as guilty without proof. Jordan realized the battle was larger than the missing phone. It was about challenging assumptions and confronting a system that allowed fear to overshadow fairness. In that moment, he understood that his silence and courage would need to speak louder than the prosecutor's words. When Grace Miller stood, the courtroom seemed to shift. Her presence was quiet but commanding, a calm that cut through the tension and fear that the prosecutor had stirred. She didn't shout or make grand gestures. She spoke with measured confidence, letting each word land with precision. Every eye turned toward her, and the room grew still, as if it recognized that this wasn't just another legal argument, it was a fight for truth. Grace began to dismantle the narrative, carefully addressing each assumption and highlighting the lack of evidence. She spoke of patterns, bias, and the systemic issues that had shaped the way Jordan had been treated. Her words were firm yet compassionate, holding the power to educate, correct, and expose the injustice that had been ignored for too long. Jordan watched her, a mix of relief and awe filling him. The fear that had weighed on him for months began to lift, replaced by hope. Angela squeezed his hand, and together they felt the strength of Grace's presence surrounding them. In that moment, Jordan realized that courage didn't always roar. Sometimes, it arrived quietly, with clarity and determination. Cutting through fear and prejudice like a light in the darkest room, Grace Miller embodied that courage, giving him the strength to believe that justice was possible. Grace Miller's voice filled the courtroom with calm authority, challenging every assumption that had been made about Jordan Harris. She methodically addressed each claim, dissecting the evidence or lack thereof with clarity that left no room for doubt. The prosecutor's narrative of guilt began to crumble under the weight of facts, testimony, and reasoned argument. She highlighted how rumors, whispers, and biases had shaped the perception of Jordan long before the missing phone incident. Emails, witness statements, and patterns of unfair treatment were brought forward, revealing a consistent history of prejudice rather than wrongdoing. Every assumption about his behavior, intentions, and character was questioned, exposing the gap between perception and reality. Jordan watched, amazed, as Grace defended not just his innocence, but his dignity. Each point she made reminded him and the courtroom that he was more than the labels others had applied to him. She emphasized that suspicion without evidence is dangerous, and that systemic bias could distort truth if left unchallenged. Angela felt tears prick her eyes as she realized the depth of Grace's advocacy. Jordan's silence and composure, combined with Grace's relentless challenge of assumptions, began to turn the tide. The courtroom's focus shifted from judgment to understanding, and Jordan began to see a path toward justice he had feared might never come. The tension in the courtroom was thick as Grace Miller presented the latest discovery. The missing phone had been found in another student's locker. A collective murmur swept through the room, some faces showing surprise, others disbelief. Jordan Harris, who had been carrying the weight of blame and suspicion for days, felt an overwhelming mix of relief and lingering hurt. The revelation changed everything. What had once seemed like an unshakable narrative of guilt was now shattered by a simple, undeniable fact. Grace calmly explained how the evidence clearly pointed away from Jordan, highlighting how assumptions and biases had fueled the wrongful accusations. She emphasized the consequences of rushing to judgment without proof, demonstrating that the system's flaws had allowed fear and prejudice to dictate action. Jordan felt his chest loosen as he processed the truth. The burden of blame that had pressed so heavily on him began to lift, replaced by a cautious sense of vindication. Angela embraced him tightly, her voice trembling with relief, whispering that justice, finally, was on their side. The courtroom shifted in atmosphere. Whispers of doubt replaced murmurs of judgment. Jordan realized that the truth had power, and that even after fear and bias had painted him guilty, facts could reclaim his name and restore his dignity. A ripple of murmurs spread through the courtroom as the story against Jordan Harris began to unravel. The discovery of the missing phone in another student's locker cast doubt on everything that had been said, forcing spectators, parents, and even some staff to reconsider what they thought they knew. Eyes shifted uneasily, whispers of disbelief and surprise filling the space that had once been dominated by certainty and judgment. Grace Miller seized the moment, presenting evidence that highlighted the inconsistencies, assumptions, and biases that had guided the school's actions and the prosecutor's narrative. Emails, testimonies, and patterns of prior treatment painted a picture of systemic prejudice, showing that Jordan had been unfairly targeted long before the incident. The courtroom listened, some leaning forward, others shaking their heads at what they were finally seeing. Jordan felt a strange mix of relief and validation. The tension that had gripped him for days began to ease as he realized that the truth was breaking through. The cloud of fear and assumption. Angela held his hand tightly, her pride shining through every anxious glance. In that moment, Jordan understood that courage, persistence, and truth could crack even the strongest facades of bias, and that the world might finally see him as he truly was: innocent, resilient, and deserving of justice. As the trial progressed, Grace Miller revealed a troubling discovery. One of the teachers involved had a documented history of unfairly targeting Black students. Records, emails, and past incident reports showed a pattern of bias, from quick assumptions of guilt to harsher disciplinary actions compared to other students. The revelation sent a ripple through the courtroom, exposing that Jordan Harris's ordeal was not an isolated case, but part of a broader issue of systemic prejudice. Grace presented the evidence calmly, connecting past incidents to the present situation. She highlighted how these repeated actions contributed to an environment where Black students were disproportionately scrutinized and blamed, often without cause. Every email, memo, and report was a testament to the teacher's consistent bias. And Grace emphasized how it had shaped Jordan's experience long before the missing phone incident. Jordan listened, a mix of shock and validation coursing through him. For years, he had sensed the unfair treatment, but now it was undeniable. Angela's hand tightened around his, a silent gesture of solidarity and relief. The courtroom began to shift, murmurs spreading as the implications sank in. Jordan realized that his fight wasn't just for himself, it was a stand against the systemic injustice that had affected countless others. With Grace exposing the truth, the path toward accountability and fairness finally felt possible. Grace Miller presented a set of emails that revealed a shocking truth. Jordan Harris had been suspected long before the missing phone incident. Teachers had quietly expressed concern, cast doubt, and shared assumptions about him in messages that circulated among staff. These weren't isolated comments, they were patterns of suspicion, judgments formed without evidence, shaping perceptions that would culminate in the morning's chaos. The courtroom shifted as the emails were read aloud. Each message painted a picture of prejudgment. Keep an eye on Jordan. He seems uneasy. Watch him closely. Not sure, but he could be hiding something. Jordan felt a mix of anger and validation. For months, he had sensed the subtle glances, whispered comments, and unfair treatment, and now he held proof that it wasn't imagined. Angela squeezed his hand, tears welling in her eyes, as Grace explained the significance. These emails showed that bias had preceded the incident, that Jordan's name had been unfairly targeted, and that the school's actions were based on assumptions rather than facts. The revelation reframed the entire case. Jordan realized that the struggle wasn't just about the missing phone, it was about confronting a system that had allowed prejudice to guide decisions. The truth, once buried in whispers and messages, was finally coming to light, clearing the path for justice and understanding. As Grace Miller continued to expose the truth, a subtle change swept through the courtroom. Classmates who had once whispered, laughed, or cast judgmental glances at Jordan Harris now shifted uneasily in their seats. The emails, evidence of prior bias, and testimonies revealed that their actions, however small or seemingly innocent, had contributed to months of stress and suspicion for Jordan. Some students avoided eye contact, their hands fidgeting nervously as the weight of their participation, even passive, became clear. The whispers that had once fueled fear now reflected back on them, highlighting their role in a story that had unfairly targeted an innocent boy. Guilt settled quietly in the room, unspoken but palpable. As the realization sank in that assumptions and bias had real consequences, Jordan noticed the change, a complex mix of emotions swirling within him: relief that the truth was finally being recognized, and hurt for the months he had endured unfair scrutiny. Angela whispered encouragement, reminding him that the moment was about justice, not vengeance. Grace's careful presentation allowed the students to confront their own role in the narrative, emphasizing accountability while fostering understanding. Jordan realized that change required awareness, that the discomfort of truth could be a powerful step toward empathy, growth, and a more just environment for all. Tension hung thick in the courtroom as Grace Miller presented the pattern of assumptions and bias that had unfairly targeted Jordan Harris. Then, unexpectedly, one of Jordan's classmates stood, voice trembling, eyes darting nervously. It wasn't him, the boy stammered, the words barely audible at first. The room went silent, all attention fixed on him as he took a shaky breath and continued. He confessed that he had hidden the phone in his own locker, and that he and a few others had whispered false suspicions about Jordan for weeks, fueled by fear, assumptions, and the desire to avoid attention themselves. Tears streamed down his face as he admitted how those whispers had escalated, snowballing into the chain of events that nearly destroyed Jordan's reputation. Jordan felt a rush of relief and vindication, though mixed with sadness for the fear and shame that had driven his peers to act so carelessly. Angela's hand tightened around his in quiet support, and Grace nodded approvingly, allowing the truth to fully emerge. The confession shifted the courtroom atmosphere dramatically. The truth, once clouded by bias, fear, and rumor, now stood clear. Jordan realized that honesty and courage could break the cycle of assumptions, and that even amidst injustice, the truth had the power to restore dignity and hope. The courtroom held its breath as more students stepped forward, one by one, to reveal a painful truth. They had allowed Jordan Harris to take the blame for something he hadn't done. Their admissions were quiet at first, hesitant and shame-filled, but as each voice joined the chorus, the pattern became undeniable. Whispers, rumors, and subtle actions over weeks had painted Jordan as suspicious, and they had said nothing to correct it. "I didn't want to get in trouble," one student confessed. "We just let it happen. I never thought it would go this far." Another admitted, "I laughed when others whispered. I thought it was harmless." The room filled with a mix of relief and discomfort as the reality settled in. Jordan had carried the weight of their fear in silence alone. Jordan's heart ached at the honesty, but he also felt vindicated. The truth was finally coming out, and the blame was no longer resting solely on his shoulders. Angela squeezed his hand, pride and relief mixing in her eyes, while Grace Miller quietly took note of the admissions, recognizing the importance of accountability. The students' confessions revealed the human tendency to avoid conflict, even at someone else's expense, and underscored the courage it takes to confront wrongdoing. Jordan realized that this moment wasn't just about clearing his name, it was about exposing the ripple effect of silence and the necessity of standing up for truth. A sudden collective gasp swept through the courtroom as the full scope of the injustice against Jordan Harris became clear. The missing phone, the whispered rumors, the biased assumptions, and the months of silent targeting all came together, painting a stark picture of prejudice and unfair treatment. Spectators leaned forward, eyes wide, as the realization settled. This had never been about a simple mistake, it had been about fear, bias, and systemic failures. Even the parents who had initially questioned Jordan now exchanged uneasy glances, their assumptions crumbling under the weight of evidence. Emails, testimonies, and confessions revealed a chain of events fueled by prejudice, showing how quickly suspicion could be manipulated into judgment, and how easily an innocent student could be vilified. The courtroom, once tense with accusation, was now heavy with recognition, understanding, and shock. Jordan felt a mix of emotions: relief that the truth was finally being seen, sorrow for the pain he had endured, and a quiet pride in his own resilience. Angela held him close, whispering reassurance, while Grace Miller's composed demeanor reflected the triumph of careful advocacy and unyielding persistence. The gasps weren't just reactions, they were acknowledgement. The injustice was no longer hidden, and for the first time Jordan's story was told with clarity, honesty, and the undeniable weight of truth. Grace Miller stood before the courtroom, her presence commanding attention without raising her voice. Every eye was on her as she spoke, her words deliberate, piercing through the haze of assumptions and fear. She recounted the months of whispers, misjudgments, and biased actions that had unfairly targeted Jordan Harris, linking each incident to larger patterns of systemic prejudice. She challenged everyone present to reflect: how often had fear or preconceptions guided their judgments? How many times had they assumed guilt before understanding, or allowed silence to let injustice continue? Her voice didn't accuse, it illuminated, holding a mirror up to the room, forcing each person to confront their own biases and the consequences of inaction. Jordan listened, a mixture of relief and empowerment coursing through him. Angela squeezed his hand, pride and hope shining in her eyes. The courtroom, once tense with judgment and whispers, fell into a contemplative silence, each person absorbing the weight of her words. Grace concluded by reminding them that justice requires more than truth. It requires courage, empathy, and the willingness to act against prejudice, no matter how uncomfortable. Jordan realized that her speech was not just for the courtroom, it was for the community. A lesson in accountability, understanding, and the enduring power of standing for what is right. The courtroom fell silent as the judge turned to Jordan Harris. For months, he had feared this moment: the eyes, the whispers, the weight of every assumption, every false accusation. Speaking meant vulnerability, and vulnerability had felt dangerous in a world quick to judge. But now, with Grace Miller at his side and the truth unfolding around him, he knew he could no longer remain silent. Taking a deep breath, Jordan stood, feeling the courtroom's gaze press down on him. His hands trembled slightly, but he straightened his back, grounding himself in the presence of Angela and Grace. He began to speak, his voice low at first, then growing steadier as he recounted the events from his perspective. He shared the fear, the confusion, and the pain of being judged without evidence, as well as the resilience it had taken to endure it all. The courtroom listened, captivated by his honesty and courage. Faces softened, some eyes glistened with understanding, and the weight of bias slowly gave way to empathy. Jordan realized that speaking his truth didn't just clear his name, it reclaimed his voice, his dignity, and his sense of self. In that moment, fear transformed into empowerment, and he finally felt seen for who he truly was. Jordan Harris stood before the courtroom, his hands clenched tightly as he took a shaky breath. His voice trembled at first, the weight of months of fear, suspicion, and injustice pressing on him. Every eye in the room seemed to magnify his anxiety, yet the truth he carried was stronger than his fear. He spoke of the mornings filled with whispers, the stares that followed him down hallways, and the constant pressure to prove himself innocent of something he never did. Each word, though quivering, landed with precision, cutting through the layers of assumptions and bias that had clouded the perception of his character. Jordan's honesty exposed the unfairness he had endured, painting a vivid picture of what it felt like to be judged for simply existing in a world eager to find fault. Angela squeezed his hand, offering quiet encouragement, while Grace Miller's calm presence reinforced his courage. The courtroom felt the impact of his words. Murmurs faded into attentive silence as listeners confronted the raw reality of systemic bias and human error. Though his voice shook, the truth struck powerfully, leaving no room for doubt. Jordan realized that courage wasn't the absence of fear, it was speaking boldly, even when the world expected him to remain silent. When Jordan finally finished speaking, the courtroom fell into a deep, heavy silence. It wasn't the silence of doubt anymore, it was the silence of realization. For the first time since this nightmare began, everyone in the room truly saw him, not as the headlines had painted him, not as the frightened teacher had assumed, and not as the prosecutor had tried to portray him. They saw a child. A hurt, frightened, resilient child, who had been dragged through a storm he never created. Jordan's voice had trembled, cracked, and fought for strength, but every word carried truth that hit harder than any accusation. The jurors' expressions softened. Some blinked back tears. Parents who once whispered fear now looked down in shame. Even students who had watched from afar felt the guilt of their silence settling over them. Grace Miller placed a steady hand on Jordan's shoulder, grounding him as he stared at the floor, overwhelmed but brave. His mother held her breath, seeing the fragile boy she had raised finally recognized for who he truly was. In that moment, the courtroom didn't see a suspect. They saw a child failed by fear, by bias, and by a system that should have protected him. And the truth of that broke the room open. The courtroom fell into a tense silence as the judge's gavel struck the bench. Jordan Harris sat upright, heart pounding, as the words that had once seemed impossible echoed clearly. He was cleared of every accusation. The months of fear, whispered rumors, and wrongful suspicion that had weighed so heavily on him were now officially dismissed. The ruling didn't just restore his innocence, it validated the truth he had carried quietly through every moment of doubt and accusation. Parents, teachers, and students shifted in their seats, some in relief, others in quiet shame as they absorbed the significance of the judgment. The court had acknowledged the systemic bias, the misjudgments, and the assumptions that had nearly ruined Jordan's life. The declaration of his innocence was more than a legal statement, it was a public affirmation that the narrative built on fear and prejudice was wrong. Jordan felt a wave of emotion, relief, vindication, and an overwhelming sense of empowerment. Angela reached over, holding his hand tightly, tears of joy streaming down her face. Grace Miller offered a small, proud nod, knowing that the fight for truth and justice had reached its rightful conclusion. For Jordan, the judge's words were a release, a chance to breathe again and reclaim the dignity and peace that had been denied to him for far too long. As the judge's words settled in the courtroom, a profound silence enveloped everyone present. The tension that had gripped the room for weeks, months even, began to dissolve. Jordan Harris, once shadowed by suspicion and whispers, could finally feel the weight of injustice lifting. The truth, long buried beneath assumptions and fear, had prevailed. The silence wasn't empty, it was heavy with reflection. Parents, teachers, and students sat in quiet contemplation, realizing how easily bias and rumor had clouded judgment. The courtroom, once filled with murmurs of suspicion and judgment, now resonated with a calm acknowledgement that justice had been restored. The moment was not just a victory for Jordan, it was a reminder of the importance of fairness, evidence, and empathy in a world quick to assign blame. Jordan exhaled slowly, his chest feeling lighter than it had in weeks. Angela's hand rested over his, grounding him in the reality that he had survived, endured, and emerged victorious. Grace Miller's calm presence beside him reinforced the power of advocacy, truth, and unwavering perseverance. In that quiet, reflective moment, it became clear, the truth had won, not through force or anger, but through courage, resilience, and the relentless pursuit of justice. Jordan's innocence had been affirmed, and the courtroom, finally, bore witness to it. The aftermath of Jordan Harris's exoneration rippled far beyond the courtroom. The school, once confident in its narrative, now faced scrutiny it had long sought to avoid. Administrators, teachers, and staff were called to account for the assumptions, bias, and mishandling that had nearly destroyed a student's life. Emails, disciplinary records, and prior complaints revealed a pattern of unequal treatment, forcing the school to confront systemic issues it had previously ignored or denied. Parents and the community demanded answers. Meetings were convened, policies reviewed, and accountability measures introduced. The realization that Jordan's experience was not isolated shook the institution to its core. Staff who had participated in or condoned unfair treatment faced disciplinary action, while leadership began acknowledging the need for reform, sensitivity training, and equitable practices to prevent future injustice. Jordan watched from the sidelines, a mixture of vindication and cautious hope settling over him. The battle had been personal, but the consequences of the school's actions served as a public lesson on the cost of prejudice and negligence. Angela squeezed his hand, proud of the strength he had shown, while Grace Miller quietly noted that change had finally begun. For Jordan, the accountability of the school was more than symbolic. It was proof that truth and courage could challenge authority, expose wrongdoing, and spark meaningful change even in institutions resistant to it. Weeks after the courtroom victory, the school issued a public apology. It was carefully worded, delivered with solemnity, acknowledging the mistakes made in handling Jordan Harris's case. Administrators admitted that assumptions and bias had played a role, that procedures had been mishandled, and that Jordan had been unfairly treated. The apology, while necessary, felt bittersweet, a formal recognition of wrongdoing, yet a reminder of the months Jordan had endured fear, shame, and uncertainty. Students, parents, and staff listened, some nodding in agreement, others avoiding eye contact, weighed down by guilt. Jordan and Angela sat together, listening quietly. For Angela, it was validation of the truth she had fought to protect. For Jordan, it was acknowledgement that his pain had been real and unjust. Yet, even as the words were spoken, a sense of frustration lingered. Why had it taken a near tragedy for fairness and accountability to surface? Grace Miller observed the moment with careful eyes, knowing that apologies, while symbolic, must be followed by action. Jordan felt a mixture of relief and lingering hurt. The apology did not erase the past, but it did affirm that justice, though delayed, could still be recognized. In that moment, Jordan realized that being seen, heard, and acknowledged was itself a powerful form of healing. The first day back at school after the courtroom victory was surreal for Jordan Harris. The hallways he had once navigated cautiously, weighed down by whispers and suspicious glances, now felt charged with a different energy. Eyes followed him not with accusation, but with curiosity, reflection, and, in some cases, newfound respect. Students who had once laughed or whispered behind his back now hesitated, unsure how to approach him. Teachers who had overlooked their biases and actions now walked more carefully, aware that their treatment of Jordan had been publicly scrutinized and corrected. The air was thick with a mix of tension, admiration, and guilt, and Jordan could feel it all, conscious of the quiet shift in perception. He carried himself differently that day, shoulders straighter, chest lifted, yet his heart remained guarded. Angela walked beside him, her presence a grounding reminder that he had survived and prevailed. Grace Miller's words echoed in his mind. Courage and truth had cleared his name, but they had also changed the way the world would see him. Jordan realized that returning to school wasn't just about resuming life. It was about reclaiming space, asserting his dignity, and navigating a world that now had to see him as he truly was, strong, resilient, and undeniably innocent. As Jordan Harris moved through the school hallways, he noticed the subtle, yet unmistakable, shift in how his peers regarded him. Some students met his eyes with quiet respect, nodding in acknowledgement of the courage he had shown throughout the ordeal. They whispered words of apology or admiration, small gestures that, though simple, carried weight after months of misunderstanding and suspicion. Others, however, could not hide the regret that clouded their faces. They had been part of the chain of whispers and false assumptions that had led to his unjust treatment. And now their guilt was visible in every hesitant glance and awkward gesture. Jordan saw the shame, the discomfort, and the realization that their actions had consequences beyond what they had imagined. For them, respect was to let regret had replaced the judgment they once passed. Angela stayed close to Jordan, her hand gently brushing his arm whenever tension flickered in his chest. He drew strength from her presence and from the knowledge that truth had finally prevailed. In these hallways, Jordan realized that the experience had changed not just him, but everyone around him. Some had learned the value of empathy and courage. Others had learned the cost of assumptions. And Jordan, having endured both, now walked with the quiet dignity of someone who had survived and grown stronger. After weeks of turmoil and fear, Jordan Harris finally sat at his desk in his quiet room, sketchbook in hand. His fingers trembled as he lifted the cover, a reminder of the notebook he had once thrown away in frustration and despair. The pages had been empty for so long, abandoned during a time when anger, pain, and self-doubt had consumed him. Now, with his name cleared and his innocence restored, Jordan hesitated for a moment, unsure if the act of drawing would bring comfort or reopen old wounds. Slowly, he began to sketch, lines tentative at first, shaky but deliberate. With every stroke, a sense of release washed over him. The notebook became a space for his emotions, a sanctuary where fear and frustration could transform into creativity and expression. Angela peeked in quietly, smiling as she watched him pour himself onto the pages. Grace Miller had reminded him that reclaiming his life meant embracing the parts of himself that had been overshadowed by others' bias. Jordan understood that his art was more than drawings. It was his voice, his perspective, and his resilience. For the first time in months, he felt a flicker of peace. With shaking hands but a steady heart, Jordan reconnected with his dreams, realizing that the act of creation could heal wounds that judgment never could. Jordan Harris leaned over his sketchbook, pencil in hand, letting his imagination take flight. After months of being misjudged, silenced, and blamed for things he had never done, he felt a surge of determination to create something that reflected his true self. On the page, a hero began to emerge, strong, brave, and resilient, just like the courage Jordan had summoned through his ordeal. For the first time, this hero looked like him. The skin tone, the features, the posture, they were unmistakably Jordan's. Every line of the drawing radiated confidence, defiance, and strength. A visual declaration that he was more than the whispers, the assumptions, or the fear he had endured. This wasn't just a character. It was a mirror of his identity, a symbol of his journey through injustice and the triumph of truth. Angela watched quietly from the doorway, feeling a deep sense of pride. Grace Miller had often told him that reclaiming his voice was the first step toward healing. Now, Jordan was reclaiming his image, putting on paper what the world had tried to deny him. As he shaded in the final details, Jordan realized the power of creation. It could transform pain into expression, fear into courage, and silence into a hero who finally, fully, looked like him. In the weeks following Jordan Harris's exoneration, the town that had once whispered and assumed began to change. Conversations that had been avoided for years started to surface. Tentative at first, filled with awkward pauses and uncertain voices. Parents, teachers, and students began to confront the biases that had allowed fear to overshadow fairness. The missing phone incident, once a catalyst for suspicion and judgment, had become a mirror reflecting the town's unspoken prejudices. In the weeks following Jordan Harris's exoneration, the town that had once whispered and assumed began to change. Conversations that had been avoided for years started to surface. Tentative at first, filled with awkward pauses and uncertain voices. Parents, teachers, and students began to confront the biases that had allowed fear to overshadow fairness. The missing phone incident, once a catalyst for suspicion and judgment, had become a mirror reflecting the town's unspoken prejudices. Community meetings were held, where residents shared personal experiences, admitting moments when assumptions had guided their judgments. Teachers discussed classroom dynamics and the need for equitable treatment. Students acknowledged the harm caused by rumors and by allowing fear to dictate their actions. Jordan's story became a framework for dialogue, a reminder that systemic issues and unconscious bias could affect anyone, and that accountability was essential. Angela watched with quiet hope as her son's experience sparked these conversations. She saw the beginning of empathy taking root where ignorance had once dominated. Grace Miller continued to guide efforts for fairness, emphasizing that awareness alone wasn't enough. It had to be paired with action. The town's conversations, though imperfect and sometimes uncomfortable, marked a turning point. Jordan's ordeal had awakened a community, inspiring reflection, growth, and a commitment to confront bias rather than ignore it. During one of the town's community meetings, parents spoke candidly about the assumptions they had made regarding Jordan Harris. Many admitted, with visible shame, how quickly they had accepted the narrative spun by rumors and fear rather than seeking facts. They confessed that in their haste to protect their own children, they had overlooked the innocence of another, allowing bias to cloud judgment and amplify injustice. Some parents spoke of the casual whispers they had repeated without thinking, how they had joined in subtle ways, reinforcing a story that was never true. Others admitted to avoiding deeper conversations, choosing comfort over inquiry, and assuming that authority figures and peers had correctly assessed the situation. The weight of their words hung in the room, heavy with remorse. Jordan, sitting quietly with Angela beside him, listened without anger. He recognized that truth and understanding often require patience and reflection, and that these parents were now confronting their mistakes openly. Grace Miller guided the dialogue, emphasizing that acknowledgement of bias was the first step toward meaningful change. The admissions, though painful, were a turning point. They reflected the importance of questioning assumptions, listening carefully, and acting with empathy. Jordan saw that even those who had once doubted him could grow, and that accountability could lead to a more just and compassionate community. In the days following the courtroom verdict, students who had once whispered, laughed, or spread rumors about Jordan Harris began to confront the consequences of their actions. Sitting in small groups or approaching him cautiously in the hallways, they sought to understand the pain they had contributed to, the fear and isolation they had inflicted on a boy who had done nothing wrong. Some admitted how easy it had been to go along with the crowd, how peer pressure and assumptions had guided their behavior. Others reflected on the shame they felt realizing how deeply their words and actions had wounded someone they now saw in a new light. The truth of Jordan's experience was difficult for them to grasp fully, yet they tried, asking questions, listening to accounts, and acknowledging the mistakes they had made. Jordan observed quietly, his heart a mix of empathy and residual hurt. He recognized that this was part of the healing process for him and for the community. Angela offered support from the sidelines, and Grace Miller encouraged dialogue rooted in honesty and accountability. Through reflection and conversation, students began to see the real impact of their actions, understanding that rumors and assumptions carry consequences. Jordan realized that even in their regret, there was a chance for growth, reconciliation, and a more compassionate future. In the weeks after Jordan Harris's ordeal, the school took a significant step toward healing by forming a support group for students affected by bias and prejudice. The group brought together children who had experienced the sting of unfair assumptions, whispered judgments, or exclusion. It became a safe space where they could share their stories, express emotions, and find comfort in knowing they were not alone. Jordan hesitated at first, but soon realized the power of speaking openly. He listened to others recount experiences that mirrored his own, moments when they had been misjudged or blamed for things beyond their control. In return, he shared his journey, recounting the fear, frustration, and resilience it had taken to face false accusations and public scrutiny. Each story, each tear, each nod of understanding, created a sense of solidarity that had been missing in the classrooms and hallways before. Angela and Grace Miller attended some sessions to provide guidance and support, encouraging honest conversation and empathy. The group fostered reflection, self-confidence, and a commitment to stand against bias in the future. Through this support network, students began to rebuild trust. recognize the importance of listening, and embrace the value of empathy. For Jordan, it was a chance not only to heal but to help others transform pain into understanding and resilience. As Jordan Harris continued to navigate life after the ordeal, he began to see the wider impact of his experience. Teachers invited him to speak to classrooms about bias, courage, and resilience. In the support group, younger students looked up to him, inspired by the way he had endured false accusations and public scrutiny. Slowly, Jordan realized that his story was more than a personal journey. It could be a beacon for others struggling to be heard. He spoke about fear, frustration, and the isolation he had felt when everyone assumed the worst. He shared how he had found strength in his mother's unwavering support and in the determination of Grace Miller, who had fought for his truth. Students and even some adults listened intently, moved by the honesty and vulnerability in his words. Many admitted that hearing his perspective made them reconsider their assumptions, actions, and the way they treated others. Angela watched proudly as Jordan discovered a new purpose, using his voice to empower others. He realized that the pain he had endured could be transformed into guidance, courage, and hope for those who had not yet found the confidence to speak up. By sharing his story, Jordan embraced the power of experience, learning that survival was not just about reclaiming his life, but about helping others reclaim theirs as well. Months after the courtroom ordeal, Jordan Harris stood on a small stage at a local youth event, facing a room full of students, parents, and community members. The bright lights and expectant eyes made his chest tighten, but he drew in a steadying breath. This time, the spotlight wasn't for scrutiny or judgment, it was for his voice, his story, and the lessons he had learned. Jordan began to speak, recounting the fear, confusion, and isolation he had endured when assumptions and bias had nearly defined his life. He shared moments of despair, the nights he had questioned himself, and the struggle to trust again. Yet, he also spoke of resilience, courage, and the unwavering support of his mother and Grace Miller. With every word, he transformed pain into a powerful message of hope and empowerment. The audience listened in rapt silence, some nodding in recognition, others wiping tears. Realizing the weight of words and the cost of prejudice, students approached him afterward, sharing their own experiences and expressing gratitude for his honesty. By the end of the event, Jordan felt a profound shift. His story had transcended personal healing. It had become a tool to inspire, educate, and empower others. The pain he had endured was no longer a burden alone. It was a force for change, turning adversity into strength. Jordan Harris walked through the school hallways with a new sense of purpose and confidence. The fear that had once shadowed every step, the whispers, the false accusations, the judgmental stares had begun to lift. Months of struggle, resilience, and advocacy had transformed him from a boy weighed down by doubt into a young person reclaiming his dignity inside. Very glance he met now reflected a different reality. Some students looked at him with respect, others with reflection, and a few with quiet remorse. Jordan had learned that the opinions of others could not define him. His worth was his own, forged in the fires of adversity and validated by truth. Angela's hand on his shoulder reminded him that love and support had been his anchor through it all, while Grace Miller's guidance had shown him the power of speaking up and standing firm. In classrooms, at community events, and within the support groups he now helped guide, Jordan shared his story, inspiring others to find courage in the face of injustice. He understood that strength wasn't about never feeling fear, it was about facing it, learning from it, and using it to grow. Jordan had emerged from his ordeal, resilient, empowered, and self-assured. From fear to strength, he had reclaimed not only his name but his identity, proving that truth, courage, and perseverance could overcome even the darkest moments. Jordan Harris's journey had been long, painful, and filled with moments that tested his courage and spirit. From the day rumors and assumptions falsely accused him, to the courtroom where his innocence was finally recognized, he had walked through shadows that threatened to dim his sense of self. Yet, through every trial, a quiet truth persisted: justice, honesty, and resilience could rise even in the darkest places. As Jordan shared his story at schools, community events, and support groups, he realized that truth was not just a concept, he was a force capable of transforming fear into understanding, silence into voice, and isolation into connection. His experiences became lessons for others, showing that prejudice and bias, while powerful, could be confronted and dismantled through courage, advocacy, and unwavering integrity. Angela and Grace Miller had been pillars of strength, but Jordan had discovered an inner resilience that could not be shaken. He had learned that darkness was temporary, and that clarity, fairness, and hope could shine through even the most challenging circumstances. The final message of Jordan's story was clear. No matter how deep the injustice, how heavy the whispers, or how isolated one feels, truth has the power to rise. And when it does, it illuminates a path for healing, justice, and a brighter, fairer world. When Jordan finally finished speaking, the courtroom fell into a deep, heavy silence. It wasn't the silence of doubt anymore, it was the silence of realization. For the first time since this nightmare began, everyone in the room truly saw him, not as the headlines had painted him, not as the frightened teacher had assumed, and not as the prosecutor had tried to portray him. They saw a child, a hurt, frightened, resilient child, who had been dragged through a storm he never created. Jordan's voice had trembled, cracked, and fought for strength, but every word carried truth that hit harder than any accusation. The jurors' expressions softened. Some blinked back tears. Parents who once whispered fear now looked down in shame. Even students who had watched from afar felt the guilt of their silence settling over them. Grace Miller placed a steady hand on Jordan's shoulder, grounding him as he stared at the floor, overwhelmed but brave. His mother held her breath, seeing the fragile boy she had raised finally recognized for who he truly was. In that moment, the courtroom didn't see a suspect. They saw a child failed by fear, by bias, and by a system that should have protected him. And the truth of that broke the room open.